Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's discussion about the first 100 days of the Trump administration. I'm Lance Ignon, Senior Associate Dean of Communication at the USC Price School of Public Policy. We are departing from our usual format today of moderator and panelist, and will instead feature a conversation of two of our nation's leading experts on the presidency. This will allow, I think, for an especially nuanced and illuminating conversation. Each speaker will start out with an overview of the president's first 100 days, and then they'll engage in conversation together. About midway, a little past that through the discussion, our speakers will respond to your questions. More on that, how you do that in a minute. Our first speaker is Jeffrey Jenkins, Provost Professor of Public Policy, Political Science, and Law at USC Price. Professor Jenkins studies American political institutions as well as the history of Congress. He's the founding editor of the Journal of Political Institutions and Political Economy and the Journal of Historical Political Economy. He's also editor-in-chief of Broad Street, a blog that focuses on historical political economy. Our second speaker is William Resh, our C.C. Crawford Professor in Management and Performance at USC Price. Professor Resh is an expert on the U.S. presidency and executive politics. He testified in February before the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform about the Trump administration's approach to downsizing the federal workforce. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge the sensitivity of today's topic. Even seemingly innocuous issues are subject to fierce debate in today's politically charged environment. That goes doubly when it comes to discussions about President Trump. But unlike political opinions expressed on cable news, today's discussion will be grounded in years of painstaking research by both of our speakers. Their observations may sound partisan to some, especially if you disagree with them, but I like to think that today's discussion will be the closest we'll get to an objective assessment of the president's first 100 days in office. A few housekeeping matters before we get started. You are encouraged to submit questions through the Q&A function on your screen, but not the chat. The speakers will do their best to respond to as many as possible in our allotted time. However, this webinar does not allow for questions to be submitted verbally to the speakers. A recording of today's event will be available in about a week on our YouTube channel, on the YouTube channel for the Price School. With that, let me turn things over to Professors Resh and Jenkins. Gentlemen.
Lance, I'll go ahead and start. As you noted, I'm Professor Jeffrey Jenkins. I'm the Provost Professor of Political Science, Public Policy, and Law here at USC. My academic strength, my intellectual strength is really the study of Congress and political parties. So I'll think a little bit about President Trump's first 100 days in his second term through that lens. So the first thing I'll note is that when we look historically at a president's first 100 days, we typically think about the president pushing a program, a policy program, and really encouraging and leveraging Congress to try to put elements of that program into law. And that's not really what we've seen in President Trump's first 100 days of his second term. The Congress has really kind of taken a backseat to the presidency and the executive branch. When I think about what stands out in my mind for his first 100 days, really two things come to mind: DOGE and tariffs. So DOGE is the Department of Government Efficiency. It's an informal organization that's led by Elon Musk, among others. And its goal is to, its stated goal is to look for fraud and inefficiency within the executive branch. I think DOGE has gotten a lot of headlines. It's done some things. It's certainly made some mistakes, and a number of those mistakes have been acknowledged by members of the executive branch. I think one big element of DOGE is that the members of the second Trump team took a look around the federal government and, kind of thought, well, what element of the federal government would stand in our way? if we wanted to do things. So if a Democratic president probably would, if a Democratic president asked that question, they would say the Supreme Court, right, which is right now packed 6-3 with conservatives. The Trump team looked at the executive branch, the executive agencies, and their ties to, in their mind, liberal NGOs. And they constructed a strategy whereby Doge would go in and bust a lot of those agencies up in the stated goal of looking for inefficiency. And I think they've been pretty successful in their goal. Whether you like that goal or not is a different question. The second thing is tariffs, right? So the president in our system has tariff authority because of power delegated by Congress. So we can go back a couple of generations and look for opportunities that Congress had to give the president kind of first mover advantage on tariffs. And in this case, to give the president kind of emergency tariff power. And the President Trump has used tariffs as kind of a cudgel, right, to essentially try to force foreign nations into reconstructing foreign trade around a position that he thought was more fair for the United States. And you know, the degree to which this is successful is an open question. President Trump has backtracked a bit on some of those tariffs, right? He's decided not to go forward with some based upon conversations that he's had with world leaders, or scaled them back or put holds on them, right? But really, for my money, the first 100 days really kind of revolves around Doge and tariffs. And at the end of the day, we shouldn't be surprised by Doge and tariffs because President Trump essentially said what he was going to do if he were elected. And he's doing what he said he was going to do. Some people don't like it. Some people do like it. But it's very much in keeping with what he stated on the campaign trail. A question that I get a lot is, well, why isn't Congress pushing back against this, right? Why is Congress and Congress's authority, which if you take a look at the Constitution, should be the primary authority in our constitutional order. Why has Congress's authority eroded over time in the face of presidential aggrandizement, and Congress just kind of sits back and oftentimes does nothing? That's a complicated question that I probably don't have time to go into, but I think the very simple answer, at least in terms of why Congress isn't acting right now, is that we live in a time of great nationalization and polarization. And that is that when citizens go to vote on election day, they usually either pull the R or the D, right? They usually essentially vote a straight ticket. And that was not true even a generation ago. So President Trump is the leader of the Republican Party. So the Republican Congress, the individual members of Congress who are Republican, don't really have an incentive to try to push back because a lot of their constituency is supportive of Trump, and they don't have the ability to really carve out stated reasons for why they're pushing back, because a lot of citizens just don't pay attention to those sorts of things. Right? Again, they get in their mind an idea of whether they're better off under R or D, and that's the way they vote across the board. So, like it or not, the Republican Party became kind of a MAGA party, right? Probably, you know, maybe not initially with President Trump's first election, but during his first administration, then afterwards, right? The Republican Party, as a party, has tied itself to President Trump. Is there a way to kind of fix this if we don't like the way that this world looks? Probably not. There's no easy fix. It's taken more than 100 years to get here, right? It's not going to take a year or 2 years to get away from here. What's been the effect of this? And then I'll turn it over to Bill. President Trump's popularity has eroded a bit since he stepped into office in his second term. I think you expect a little bit of that, right? But I think the tariffs have backfired to some extent, right? In that they've created a great deal of uncertainty in different areas of the American economy. Business leaders don't like uncertainty. Individual citizens, like myself, when I look at my retirement fund every day now, unfortunately, we don't like this sort of thing. There's been a lot of pushback against some of the things that he's been doing. And you can kind of see that he's pulling back a little bit from those things because of some of that pushback that he's getting. So I'm not an expert on the administrative state, where I think there's a lot of interesting and perhaps, scary things going on. So let me turn it over to my colleague Bill Resh.
Thanks, Jeff. First of all, I just thanks for all the insights, and I agree with most of your assessment. And I want to just kind of preface my comments with saying that, my work is very much concentrated on the relationship of the president or a presidential administration to the quote unquote administrative state. And I don't use that in a with negative connotation, which sometimes it might be perceived with negative connotation. I just am talking, kind of analytically about the administrative apparatus of the state, right? And so, the first 100 days of Trump's second term, I believe that we've seen a theoretical concept that is kind of popular in comparative politics, but usually talking about, the construction or democratization somewhat of, post-authoritarian states, or it's used in kind of post-conflict areas when states are developing. But I'm going to use the term same way or in a similar fashion, but to describe what I think is being kind of constructed under the Trump administration and pretty rapidly under the first through this first 100 days. And that's the concept of a parallel state. That's a system of governance that is intended to operate kind of alongside and increasingly above our constitutional institutions. And I really believe that what we're seeing is it manifests as a kind of an administrative fact as to how the Trump administration is planning to and is effectively governing. And that transformation isn't occurring through legislation. It's not occurring through some broad public mandate, despite the rhetoric, right? It's unfolding through executive directives. We've seen more executive orders in just the first 100 days of this administration than several presidencies combined. It's driven through loyalty-driven kind of personnel policies and what I think is a deliberate erosion of bureaucratic independence, and some of that can certainly be justified, and some of it may not be. But the one thing that is happening, or one way to characterize what's happening, is that it's happening quickly. They truly are flooding the zone with these executive mandates, with personnel decisions, with reconstruction or deconstruction of agencies. So we could begin, if we're reviewing the last 100 days, I would begin with the most symbolic and perhaps the most consequential development, which Jeff had mentioned, which was the creation of DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. That was established on day one. It was placed under this informal leadership, if you will, of Elon Musk. Which I believe is an arrangement that really exemplifies the fusion of public power with private capital that defines a parallel state. DOGE was granted sweeping authority to quote unquote modernize federal agencies, but really that's a euphemism for rapidly downsizing civil service ranks, which Jeff, I believe, rightly identifies as being perceived by the Trump administration as an obstacle towards advancing their policy interests administratively. That means terminating regulatory programs, and really it's also a euphemism for redirecting funds to ideological preferences in terms of policy without the consent or even conversation with Congress. Just in the first month, some examples: DOJ shuttered the Buffalo field office of the National Labor Relations Board, which had been investigating labor violations by both Tesla and Starbucks. It also suspended a Department of Transportation inquiry into Tesla's self-driving software, even at the same time as Musk's companies were bidding on new contracts with other agencies that, by the way, they now help oversee. And I'm not just putting it on Musk. I'm just saying this is the most symbolic kind of a manifestation of this push towards what I see as a patrimony, right? A patrimonial kind of presidency. They reflect this structural reorientation of administrative authority away from a neutral enforcement of law, if you will, and towards politically motivated discretion. Now, at the same time, Trump is about to reinstate. There's a rule under review by OPM that is bringing back, the infamous Schedule F that he attempted at the end of his first administration, and that's going to reclassify tens of thousands of federal employees into at-will positions, and that will strip career protections from employees who are deemed to have policy influence. And regardless of where you stand on that, in practice, that is going to lead to the removal of many people with a lot of experience in these agencies. We've already seen the removal without those types of classifications of senior scientific advisors at EPA, seen the removal of staff attorneys at Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, economic analysts at Department of Labor. And all of this leads to, a lot of internal dissent. If they were worried about internal dissent previously, well, they're not doing much to, quell that. In fact, I think they're doing quite the opposite, is that, a lot of people have low morale, but also they're reducing the relative expertise within these agencies. We've heard reports of scientists at places like the FDA who've scrubbed memos that had language that could be viewed as disloyal. And, the effects of these actions are cascading through the agencies. These voluntary resignation programs that DOJ implemented, led to over 30,000 civil servants, accepting those terms. Although the terms, I don't know if they're necessarily legal. They're still being, worked out through the courts. But they've also instituted these hiring freezes where they're kind of strategically instituting attrition, right? So they have this 4-to-1 attrition rule. So for 4 people have to leave before an agency is allowed to hire a new person, right? Of course, there are exceptions that they have across different agencies, particularly those agencies that are ideologically aligned with the presidency. But overall, this is leading to what I would characterize as a systemic thinning of the federal workforce. And we see this as well through oversight mechanisms. The infamous, I'm not sure if it was a Friday or a Saturday, but where they fired 17 inspector generals, including those at HHS and the Department of Interior, which are traditionally agencies that, Republicans have wanted to, or conservatives, I should say, have wanted to reform. But instead of doing so through legislative means, eliminating oversight mechanisms that might allow them to more easily do that through unilateral means through the presidency. In parallel to all these purges is an expansive campaign of what I call strategic privatization. You look at Musk's companies, like XAI. XAI was granted access to federal data infrastructures to develop quote unquote public service algorithms. Palantir, which is a firm that is very close to the Trump administration in terms of campaign donations, has been tapped to redesign IRS data systems and defense procurement algorithms. And it certainly goes beyond contracting. It reflects what I would say is a transfer of state functions to politically connected entities, whether these are private prison operators that work that are now contracted through Department of Homeland Security, to these IT firms as well. Education policy, following a similar logic, Trump signs an executive order to unilaterally dismantle the Department of Education, and certainly in line with conservative principles, dating back to Reagan, but again, done without the consent or really even conversation with Congress. So what we see is a pattern: the delegitimization of career expertise, reconstitution of government capacity around loyalty and really patronage, and the really displacement of public oversight by displacing that with private discretion. And that's precisely, I think, what a parallel state model would anticipate. It's not going to be a dramatic coup, but it's going to be very quiet. But Trump's, has difficulty, being quiet in anything he does. But really, it's a procedural re-engineering of what administrative agencies do, how they serve our separation of power system. It's serving the presidency, and it's important to note what's missing here, which is Congress, right? And Jeff alluded to this. Congress has largely been incapacitated by this partisan alignment that we see with the executive. But judicial review, it's still functioning, but it, just constitutionally, structurally moves slowly. And it's now filtered through a Supreme Court that has, of course, already signaled a hostility towards agency discretion. And so dismantling, these administrative agencies is maybe in line with the preferences and emerging doctrine of that court. So I would just say in sum that this first 100 days have provided a blueprint, not just for deregulation or civil service reform, but I think a reconfiguration of state power itself. The transformation is not merely about reducing government. I really think it's about reassigning it away from institutions that were made to mediate between public interests and private power. And now it's more towards a regime of executive-centered, market-integrated authority. And when I mean market-integrated, I don't mean integrated to allow for free markets. That is more to put a thumb on particular markets based off of political loyalty. Now, one could argue that this is the case across parties. And I think there is a decent argument to be made in terms of the increasing over time, historically ceding policymaking power from the legislature to the executive. This has been happening since FDR, but I would say, sped up substantially over the last 40 years through what we call the administrative presidency. Congress, there's not a piece of legislation that doesn't cede some authority to the executive in terms of discretion, right? But this is really on steroids, like ramping it up at a pace we've never seen, and really reconstituting the way we think about our separation of power system. And so with that, I think I'll leave it open for Q&A and also a little conversation with Jeff before we get to the audience. And so, Jeff, your thoughts in terms of what I just said, but particularly, you're the historical political economist, right? And so I'm really interested, especially since you've, most of your work has concentrated in terms of the relationship between Congress and the president, or specifically on the legislature. How you see, what I'm saying, is it true? I mean, I've never seen in my life so much ceding of authority from the legislature to the presidency. And I remember, I'm young enough or old enough to remember Obama, and used an aligned Congress to work, to establish, some really significant legislation, right? Namely the Affordable Care Act, right? George W. Bush did so for tax cuts. Trump did so for tax cuts. Really aligned, when he had that partisan alignment, used it to see through significant legislation. I don't see as much significant legislation in the first 100 days. I see a lot of the legislature just ceding authority to the executive to operate unilaterally. And I'm wondering if you think that is, unique in terms of, historically, and what you think about it generally.
So first off, I think, I loved your intro. I think you should write an essay on it, right? Kind of a big, broad essay of the transformation as you kind of laid out, because I think that would be really useful. I was thinking about this very question earlier today as I was kind of just getting ready. Do we see anything like, can we, I often tell my class, right? History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, right? And, do we see anything like this? And I think there are some parallels, right? The Wilson presidency and the FDR's presidency, of Congress taking a back seat and letting the president lead in terms of laying out a program and getting members of Congress to just kind of get in line behind that, right? So Wilson came into power when the Republicans were fractured, right, between Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft. And Wilson came in with not even a majority, and a bunch of, a lot of members of Congress came in on his coattails, again, because the Republicans, which were the majority in the country, were fractured. So they looked to him for leadership, that they were only going to continue in this kind of faux leadership position because of things that Wilson decided to lay out. FDR comes into power, after the Depression really started to hit the country. And he laid out a very radical agenda for the time, and really just kind of pushed Congress to adopt it all, right? Trump is operating in a similar way, and that Congress is taking a back seat to a lot of things that he's doing, but he's not asking Congress to do anything, really, right? Except, not show disloyalty, not speak out against him. Right. And we haven't seen a great deal of that. The closest that we've seen to it is as some of the tariffs got put into place, individual members of Congress were getting a lot of recoil from some of their constituents. And rather than kind of do much in the way of public criticism, they went to him and looked for exemptions, right, for their industries in their states. And they got them that way. There was a little bit of, there was a glimmer of the notion that if Trump's tariffs really kind of ratcheted things up and he kept his word and stuck to them over a long period of time, and the market still, continued to tank, there could be enough of an incentive for Republicans in Congress to act against him. And we started to hear some rumblings about this, but I think that Trump is among a lot of things. He's just very cognizant of how things are going and which way the wind is blowing, and what kind of feedback he's getting, especially from members of his party. So he stepped back from some of that stuff and took some of the heat off. So I think when I was in graduate school, right, 30 years ago now, we talked about the big problem in our country was the administrative presidency just getting huger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And, that you had this unelected slate of bureaucrats who were making so many decisions, and our elected officials kind of are taking a back seat to them. And the irony here is that Trump, as the president, is at the head of the executive branch. And he's using all of his energy to break apart the executive branch, right? To smash agencies within the executive branch, agencies that are not, traditionally aligned with conservative or radical perspectives. So he's, among other things, taking out his own knees in some ways, right? He's reducing the power of the executive branch. And I think you did a great job of laying out, well, where's that power going, right? It's not going to Congress. It's not going to the courts, right? It's not going into a black hole, right? It's being picked up by the private firms and private markets. Private actors are stepping into the breach and willing to take that delegated authority. It's not really delegated in the traditional fashion, but when you break apart an agency, right, somebody has to essentially step in and do that work. And the private firms, the private markets are willing to do that. We don't talk enough about this, right? This is not an easy issue to explain to people, right? And I don't have a great deal of optimism about our media being able to communicate this well. Even media who try. I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 30 years is that media organizations have been whittled back. Career reporters who had a lot of experience and knowledge, right, get laid off, get fired, and you start to get, 25 and 28-year-old stringers being hired, right, to do a lot of this work. And while they're trying to do the work, right, they don't have the background, they don't have the experience. There are concerns that some of them have a pretty ideological background. That's why they went into journalism, right? So you have a lot of issues, right, that in terms of getting news out to you that's important and constructed in a way that really carries out the mission of the news media, and that's really giving a broad portrait of what's actually going on and some of the consequences it can lead to.
Well put. The shift that I'm talking about certainly isn't kneecapping the president, right? It's kneecapping some of the executive branch. But if then, the existing executive branch or at least the executive branch as we knew it, in terms of this construct of various agencies, is diminished in terms of its power. Eventually you're still going to have to govern, right? And, he's had the advantage in the first 100 days of not having a huge, environmental incident or, any, huge security threats, domestically at least, right? And so there haven't been these crises where you need to say, okay, well, how do we, react to this? And where is the capacity to do so, right? But eventually these contingencies are going to arise. And the question is then, who do you rely on? And if the answer is that you rely on the contract state or you rely on these private actors, that's absolutely fine. If that's your preference, right? But the point is that, there's two things, right? Particularly for things like national emergencies, but many different aspects of government are created exactly because of market failures, that there just simply isn't a market to fill these gaps. And so what the government does is it creates markets, right? It incentivizes, a contract market, for instance, right? It says, okay, we have this thing that the private sector would not have coalesced around and begun, kind of a competitive market for. And so we're going to create incentives for them to compete and build these organizations. The problem is that once you provide a contract, these contracts become very sticky. That is, you become basically locked into your vendor, because once a vendor is selected, all the potential competition around that given need starts to kind of fall away, right? They don't stick around to wait for the next contract in 4 years. They direct their investments towards other things, right? And so what you end up doing is then paying for further delegation, right? You end up paying at a premium as well, right? And also because the delegation is extended, it's not just directly to the agency; it's to the agency to then find a contractor, to find a third party to implement these things, and maybe even to construct an entire institution from scratch if you've kneecapped the entire agency, right? That the risk of the I shouldn't say the risk aversion, the potential for moral hazard, the potential for agency loss actually even increases even more, right? Especially if you've gotten rid of a lot of the oversight functions. We've seen since the Clinton administration, we've seen this exponential increase in the contract state. We've seen an exponential increase in how much we contract out. If you compare that then to the stasis of the size of the career civil service, right? But specifically those responsible for contract oversight, that's remained at like 1.8% of the entire civil service is dedicated to, contract oversight. To the extent that, some scholars have noted that, in some agencies, that could be 1,000 contracts for every contract management employee that you have within the agency, right? So how do you manage 1,000 contracts, with a 40-hour, week? Some of this becomes fairly impossible to do. Let alone getting rid of inspector generals, let alone getting rid of, auditors. Much of what the civilian civil service did was actually oversight functions. And so what I see is an increasing danger of agency loss, not agency in the traditional sense. I'm talking about from an economic standpoint of, a delegation problem in which you find someone, an agent, to carry out a task, but you lose, the purpose of that delegation because you don't have the capacity to really oversee what they're doing. And private sector actors have even more incentive to extract rents from the public good in implementing, right? They want to keep their cost margins low, their profit margins high, right? And so, where they can cut, corners, they will. And that doesn't really pretend to efficiency from the public standpoint. It only pretends to efficiency from that private actor standpoint. And so it's just something that we need to consider if you want to shift all this capacity to private sector entities. I know there are efficiencies to be found within the private sector compared to the public sector. That's not a question. But if you do it whole cloth, there's a lot of potential for moral hazard that doesn't lead to efficiency from the standpoint of the taxpayer. It doesn't lead to efficiency from the standpoint of the public. It leads to maybe efficiencies from the standpoint of those individual agents, those private firms. And so it's just something to be careful for in terms of what you wish for in the deconstruction of, the quote unquote administrative state.
Cronyism. You're worried about cronyism, right? Essentially,
yep, in one word. One word. We see a ton of patronage. We see, we see norms that have, completely been stripped away in terms of, a president, saying, I'm going to keep, this at arm's distance if it's tied to my own pockets, right? And my own financial interests, my own personal financial interests. And the same with agency heads, and the same with, the various, proxies of the president throughout administration. That, these norms have been largely abandoned in many respects.
Gentlemen, we have quite a few questions. I think a lot of good ones too. If we could pivot to that for a few moments, and that'll probably help spur some more conversation. I wanted to start with one from John Rockford. Thank you, Mr. Rockford, for your question. The question is, you mentioned two areas of focus being DOGE and tariffs. What about the border? I see that as the number one issue he dealt with, and he dealt with it quickly and successfully.
I think clearly immigration would be some broad form of immigration would be certainly a third thing that I could have added to that, right? TOJ, tariffs, and immigration. Um, it's clear that he wanted to make changes at the border, and I think some of those changes were actually implemented late in the Biden administration already, right? As information finally got filtered to that administration that important changes really needed to be made because they were really getting hammered in the media over some of that. But clearly, that was something that he as John noted, right, made a priority, and he dealt with it. And now the question comes down to um, uh, how should we think about immigration policy going forward, right? A lot of attention has been spent on undocumented people being in the country and the degree to which we can identify them and remove them from the United States. It's not clear to me that the rate at which we are removing people like this is really all that different than previous administrations. There are some high profile cases, and I think the media has been very interested in covering some of those around gang members, right, from other countries who might be here. Um, but we don't really have, one of the things that we haven't had for many, many years is a new comprehensive policy on immigration, right? I think the Trump administration is fairly nativist in orientation, right? They're not really so interested. And here I think about some key domestic policy advisors that he has, like Stephen Miller, right, who is just not interested really in having people from outside the United States be here. Right? He's stated very publicly that he believes that they are taking positions in our universities, seats in our universities that should be going to domestic students. Now, as we kick some of these people out, or as we prevent immigrants from other countries from coming in, there's a brain drain, right? Some of these people are high-skilled immigrants. And the question then becomes, do we have people here that have just been blocked from those positions, right? Do we just have, the feeders here in the United States just needed to be opened? And I'm not sure that that's true either. So the quick fix is close the border, right, with Mexico, but a more comprehensive immigration policy has not really been something that's talked about.
Yeah, I would second that, saying yes, it's been dealt with quickly. I think successfully is going to be relative to your ideological perspective. But I will say that I think the American voters generally still to this day don't appreciate exactly how radical the classic liberal democracy really is, and how radical our Constitution is in terms of its emphasis on rule of law. And we can, you can, say, these people broke the law, therefore they should be deported. But that doesn't mean that they can be deported according to our Constitution and standing law without due process. But due process has been, in many cases ignored. And and then the Trump administration's excuse is, well, we don't have enough immigration judges to process these cases as quickly as we want. Well, I'm sorry, that's not, according to the law, that's not, a legitimate excuse. Also, by the way, you have the power through the presidency to hire and appoint immigration judges to catch up with the caseload. And so I think that there's, the successful part is, your perspective on, the importance of due process. But I would make an argument that due process is not being emphasized in terms of this policy. And where you stand on that normatively is your business, but how how the Constitution, interprets it and how the Supreme Court, the current Supreme Court interprets it, seems to be, that this is not following, many of these cases are not following due process.
So I wanted to raise one issue that's kind of floating around here, and it's something that we get some criticisms in political science for not studying enough, and that is power, right? Where does power come from? What is it, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of it a lot of what we think about how much power the Congress has, how much power the president has, how much power the Supreme Court has, is based upon what's written in the Constitution and maybe in statutes over time. I think another form of power is when one institution does something and watches to see how the other institutions react and maybe how the citizenry reacts, right? So I think one thing that the Trump administration has done these first 100 days has been to, as you note, flood the zone with a lot of executive orders to hire a group of people to go in and investigate, and while investigate, breaking apart a bunch of agencies, and then see where the chips fall after all that, right? See what Congress does, see what the courts do, see how citizens react, right? And if all of those institutions, including the citizenry, acquiesce, then that becomes the de facto power that resides within the presidency more generally, right? One thing I tell my students, right, and when we have conversations around all of this, is pull out your Constitution. Of course, they don't have one, but rhetorically, pull out your Constitution. Show me in that Constitution where the Supreme Court has the ability to review acts of Congress and decisions made by the presidency. Where is judicial review in the Constitution? Well, it doesn't exist, right? Because it's not written down in the Constitution. It was created by Chief Justice John Marshall very early in the 19th century. And Congress acquiesced to that, and the president acquiesced to that. And then suddenly, the Supreme Court has judicial review, right? That's one form of power that we don't think about as much as we should. So when we talk about Congress, essentially stepping away and not doing anything, to the extent that the courts also do that, then the president becomes very powerful in our system.
Yep.
And because of partisan alignments and the degree to which partisanship at the national level forces members of Congress into silence, because they're so dependent upon presidential popularity and the things that he does, and courts don't have a private army of officers to enforce decisions. They rely upon the president to enforce their decisions. A president can be very powerful if he or she decides to really push the envelope.
And, even if Marbury v. Madison was specifically articulated in the Constitution, it wasn't, the creation of the courts themselves, right? Even if it was explicitly there, the calculus would remain that the president has incredible first mover advantages, right? They move, Congress can react, but Congress has to collectively react, they have to, deliberate. By the time that deliberation is done, and again, maybe this de facto kind of, equilibrium is created by the president. And so it's a great point. And, in terms of, constitutional dynamics, right, we have to remember, what is explicitly, the powers of these institutions, right? And, to appropriate is Congress's power, right? President's power is to faithfully execute the law, right? And so, and, of course, other powers, but, there's a reason that they spent so much time articulating the powers of Congress and not so much the president, is that, they had, a lot of ideas as to the people, largely represented by the legislator, having, say over how the country was to, be governed, right? And so if the president is taking away, so we have a question actually from Frank Thompson, if you don't mind me going to that, where he says, I read the GAO plans to investigate the degree to which the Trump administration has unlawfully failed to spend money that Congress has appropriated. The administration believes that efforts to restrict impoundment is unconstitutional, and asks if we have any projection on how this conflict will be resolved. Well, the president did have, unstated impoundment powers until what was it? When was the Impoundment Act? 1974?
1974. Yeah.
Yeah. And so Congress has legislated on that and said that, impoundment is illegal, that is unconstitutional, that there is standing legislation saying that the president cannot impound funds that Congress intended. Now, the president can think that that's unconstitutional, but there is nothing in the Constitution that says the president can decide what is and what isn't constitutional. The president is to faithfully execute the law, right? And so if Congress has made a law, it is not the president's, unless you abide by a very radical and generally considered, outside the scope of, of what most legal scholars would consider legitimate unitary executive theory. Unless you abide by that theory, there is no standing for a president to impound, appropriations at their choosing, as long as that law is on the books. Now, this court might later decide or align with the president, say, yeah, you know what, it is unconstitutional. But until they do, there is no, standing for a president to decide on their own that it's unconstitutional.
Let me turn maybe with the last no, we have 9 minutes or so, something that I think hits us close to home, and that is in the first 100 days, Trump's relationship with universities, right? That's something that we can speak to. There was a question on here asking how has his first 100 days affected USC? And we could talk about that, but I think more generally, his administration has really kind of focused on attacking some very elite universities, Ivy League universities, Harvard in particular, Columbia, some others, and placing restrictions on the federal grants that those universities received, and essentially telling them that they need to do X, Y, and Z in order to get this money. A number of them have gone along with his demands, right? Harvard decided to fight, and some suggest that Trump's demands to Harvard were so beyond the pale that he actually wanted them to not go along, right? He wants this to actually get into the courts and fight it out in the courts. Do you want to start in terms of just thinking about how university life might change, has changed, and might change in the near future?
Well, I mean, I think these first mover advantages that the president has have affected many industries, including higher education, in terms of, there's a lot of fear by these institutions to push back. And, you're seeing, some acquiescence as a function of the powerful first mover status that a president has. They'd love to, I don't think people want to spend, millions of dollars litigating. I don't think that, that they're interested in pushing back on issues that might not be of, incredible salience to the general university, general university interests or to a given industry's interest. But at the same time, it seems to be some arbitrary and capricious, use of executive power, especially in terms of picking on specific universities or in the legal industries, picking on specific law firms based off of, the personal grudges that the president has over, something they've done. They're pursuing Title VI violations with Harvard and Harvard Law Review. I saw that was just announced. And those will be litigated in the courts, right? I think ultimately, I think that these institutions are kind of bracing themselves and just seeing how this, kind of passes with a couple institutions. And so in the meantime, we've seen a lot of, let's say risk aversion. And they're waiting for those, more slow-moving institutions to catch up with the presidency. But again, I think he's doing the damage that he wanted to get done with his first mover advantages.
Yeah. So one of the things that maybe some people out there might not um, be cognizant of is that his advisor suggested 15% as the level of overhead on federal grants.
Yeah.
And generally speaking, that's very low relative to what universities often charge. That's in keeping with some other groups that might provide grants to universities, but in terms of what universities charge, it's oftentimes twice or more than twice that amount, and that's caused a lot of problems at a number of universities. Um, and we could probably speak a little bit here, but at a lot of research universities, we're moving into an era of austerity, right? Where budgets are being cut. Leaders are being very risk averse because they're worried about the level of funds coming in, especially research universities that are tied to large medical centers, right? They're really being hit because of this 15% overhead level. What we see at universities, or what we see here at USC, is some of the same, right? We're getting into a period where we have to essentially tighten our belts a bit, and this is something that's probably going to go on for some time. And ultimately, to get some of these dollars back that Columbia got back and some other places, you have to give up some of your academic freedom, right? That's the cost of getting some of these dollars back. You have to essentially say, yes, I'll go along with these various things. A lot of this has been pushed under the guise of anti-Semitism, right? Pushing against some of the protests that we've had over the last couple of years, right? And I think I'm maybe a little bit out of the orbit of a lot of people at universities, in the sense that I think universities have made some real mistakes over the last X number of years, right? That there's been a general lack of leadership at a lot of universities over some important issues. And I don't think that we should have to pay in these ways. I don't think we should have to give up our academic freedom for that. But I think some of the consequences we're facing now are because of lack of leadership at home.
Oh, Jeff, well, maybe I'm out of the orbit with you, but I actually, wholeheartedly agree with that statement. I think I recently said, use this quote, and I don't know if I was paraphrasing somebody else, but I said, if you can't stand on principle, then maybe you don't deserve the chair, right? And there seems to be like a lot of leaders, in quote unquote leaders within our higher education institutions that really, are unwilling to stand on principle. And bend, to, more, where's the money coming from, right? And so, this is a general trend across higher education, corporatizing, the model. And so maybe we need to rethink as a society, what is the purpose of higher education? It used to be, not just towards whether or not you produced X amount of skilled workers, but also the socialization of our citizenry, right? And from a civic standpoint, having an informed citizenry that is able, to make, informed decisions at the ballot box, and also in terms of civic engagement, and to be actively civically engaged. So regardless of where you stand ideologically, I think one lesson that has emerged over the last 20, 30, even 40 years has been, a precipitous decline in, the capacity of our citizenry to really even understand the political institutions to which, it's, by which we govern. And so, if there's anything that comes out of this in a positive way, one thing I hope would be that, people start paying attention a little bit more. And, as Jeff, borrowing from you in a previous conversation, but to be more present in terms of how our how we are governed, and to pay more close attention to this, and to reinvest in ways to increase transparency, but also to increase engagement, whether it's at the voting booth or otherwise.
A lot of this, we could go into great detail. I think we're probably close to time now.
Yeah.
But education in the United States is not in a great place. Going down to grammar schools, elementary schools.
I just want to give a nod to everybody that showed up and all the good questions that are here. And I wish that we did have time to answer a lot of these. Feel free to email me at wresh@usc.edu. If I didn't get to your question, I'm happy to engage with you. As long as it's on a civil level, happy to do that, right? And so feel free to reach out if we didn't get to your questions. And with that, any parting words, Jeff, that you'd like to?
I would say that, a lot of these questions kind of rely upon me having a crystal ball. And if I had a crystal ball, I wouldn't be here. I would be, retired on a desert island, right? Living off of my huge, campaign trust, right? I wish I had a crystal ball that I could answer some of these questions well. What bugs us is that we wish we could predict things, right? Social scientists are good at explaining things. We're not very good at predicting things.
Thank you, everyone, for showing up today. And I hope you'll tune into our next Price Presents, which will be next fall. And thank you again to Bill and Jeff for a really interesting conversation today.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. Thanks, Lance. Thanks, Deidre.
Always a pleasure, Jeff. Thank you. Thank you, Lance. Much appreciated. And thank you, everybody, for showing up and for
thanks,
the questions.
Guys out there.